Warning, I say a lot of bad words. If you're under 13, you probably shouldn't be watching this. This upcoming November will mark the 10-year anniversary for the release of The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword. You know that one clip of Solid Snake turning into an old man? Yeah, that's me right now. This game came out when I was 14 and depressed, and right now I'm 24 and still depressed. It originally came out in celebration of the series' 25th anniversary, along with being the 5th 3D Zelda game, and one of the final games released for the Wii before Nintendo went on to make that one console that didn't do very well. It's also one of the most polarizing games of the past several years. While it got strong critical acclaim at the time of release, Skyward Sword has been pretty heavily scrutinized from the time it came out to now, with a lot of people really not liking this game, or at least major aspects of this game. I wouldn't go as far as to say that reception towards Skyward Sword is overwhelmingly negative, as the game does have its fans, but it's so love it or hate it that you could get away with stamping "directed by Ryan Johnson" on the cover. Overall, it's easily the least liked of the 3D Zeldas, which granted isn't saying much on its own given the immense praise that each game typically receives, but still, it's pretty rare to see a game be as contentious as this one is. All the people ripping into the motion control combat, the linear game design compared to previous games, the mere existence of Fi, and acting like anyone who gave this game such high praise was somehow in the wrong. Maybe I just have an absurdly high tolerance for bullshit. I've worked in retail for 4 years non-stop, it's certainly a possibility. But it always threw me off how so many people painted so many aspects of Skyward Sword as game-breaking flaws that ruined the entire thing, when most complaints never fazed me, or at worst, only mildly annoyed me. To be honest, it always bummed me out how it seemed like so many people, especially within the whole YouTube review circle, seemed to really dislike Skyward Sword because I fucking loved it. And after replaying it through the HD Switch remaster, I still do. Granted, I'm obviously more conscious about issues as an adult well above the drinking age than I was when I was too young to drive, but I still think this game is really good. I wanted to do a video on Skyward Sword going over why I personally love it, and to also throw other fans of this game a bone after probably being sick of so many people dunking on it for the better part of a decade. Eventually, I do want to cover every 3D Zelda and why I think they're all fantastic in their own right, but currently this one is the most fresh in my mind, so we're gonna start here. Alright, before starting, I feel like I should clarify that I'm not trying to imply the game is without fault or that a lot of the common criticisms towards it are unfounded. I do have my issues with it, and I will bring them up when the time calls for it. I just feel like the game doesn't get enough credit for all the many things I think it does really, really well. I suppose it's fitting that the first Zelda game I'm talking about is also chronologically the first one in the series, essentially telling the origin story of several important pillars of the Zelda series as a whole. The Master Sword, the Temple of Time, the repeating cycle of Link, Zelda, and Ganon's reincarnations throughout the franchise. Skyward Sword opens giving some backstory on how the game's setting came to be in the state it's currently in. Basically, a bunch of dark, evil forces came out of the earth, became hungry for power, and enacted war and genocide on the humans as they do. For the humans' protection, the goddess Hylia removed a massive chunk of land and sent it, well, skyward. Sword. While Hylia was able to fend off the evil army, it seems as though history is about to repeat itself given that this horrifying abomination unearthed. Man, it looks so cool. Hopefully the game doesn't make you fight him 3 times or anything. Cut to the main setting, Skyloft, the opening scene pretty much puts everything perfectly into perspective. Skyloft is a lively, active place, while Link, by stark contrast, is bumbling and lazy, needing Zelda to wake him up so he doesn't miss an important ceremony, immediately setting in motion the main narrative theme of the game. Also, knowing my own sleeping habits, I feel personally attacked by this. Starting off, I will admit that the opening hour does tend to drag longer than it should with how tedious the whole finding your kidnapped bird companion is, but ultimately the opening does do its job, teaching the basics of gameplay as well as establishing Skyloft as this lovely bustling town in the sky, Link's polarizing reputation among the Knight Academy, particularly with Groose, the man in legend himself, and the close intimate relationship Link and Zelda share together. Honestly, I just like getting to explore and experience the typical mundanity of Link's home and everyday life prior to the actual adventure kicking off, seeing the landmarks, talking to all the NPCs, and flying on a Loftwing for the first time. Again, a bit of fat could have and probably should have been trimmed, but still. Following Link winning the tournament and getting some special alone time with Zelda, some evil-looking tornado sucks Zelda in and knocks Link unconscious, where he both subconsciously and then physically meets Fi, or Fi. I'm gonna call her Fee because I like it better and I do what I want. Essentially, she was created by the goddess Hylia for the purpose of being a guide for the chosen hero. Should be obvious who the chosen hero is. This guy. We're in good hands. The initial goal set forth by Fee and Zelda's father is to have Link take the sword hidden within the big Hylia statue, and then descend to the surface below to find Zelda and bring her home. However, this quickly proves to be nowhere near as simple as they thought, with Link and Fee consistently hitting dead ends in each new region they visit, being told by Zelda's guardian Impa that he's got a lot to do before he'll be able to see Zelda again, along with clashing several times with the game's main antagonist, Girahim, thus sending Link down a journey that'll prepare him to save Zelda and prevent the dark evil thing from coming back and finishing what it started all those years ago. Conquering the Silent Realms, transforming this dumb little sword into the Master Sword we all know and love, visiting a bunch of big scary dragons to learn how to play the harp, and ultimately gaining all 3 pieces of the Triforce to, in the end, defeat Girahim and not Ganondorf. Skyward Sword to me is a story about characters going through personal growth, ultimately reaching their full potential and finding their purpose in life, regardless of whether it's part of some divine plan or not. The main recurring theme around this is characters having their own personal moments of awakening, which, again, is set in motion right as the game begins, with the imprisoned being awoken for the first time, and Link being woken up by Zelda. Each of the main cast has their own purpose and reason for existing, it's just a matter of finding out what exactly that purpose is and fulfilling it. Link, of course, going on his life-changing adventure to transform from bumbling sleepyhead to the chosen hero, and Zelda having to sacrifice and let go of her peaceful life in Skyloft to fulfill her purpose as the reincarnation of Hylia. Obviously, these two are the most focused on concerning the overarching theme of awakening to fulfill your purpose, and it's thankfully pretty strong in execution. The game does a phenomenal job making the two's relationship feel more intimate and personal than it's ever been before, or honestly since. Link isn't doing what he's doing just to fulfill his duty, he's doing it all for the person he cares about more than anyone or anything else. The moment where Zelda is encased in deep slumber for thousands of years is such a powerful callback to the game's opening. Link, the guy who started off too lazy to wake himself up, instead relying on Zelda to do so, must now prove that he is worthy of taking on the responsibility of returning the favor this time. It's a genuinely heartbreaking scene and one of my favorite narrative moments from the entire franchise. Half of why it's so effective is that the game did a great job conveying the relationship between both characters, and making Zelda herself just so sweet and lovable. You just can't not want the best for her. Then there's Girahim, this absolute fucking dork of a demon lord. The purpose he's attempting to fulfill is to awaken his dormant master Demise, whom is essentially that imprisoned guy I talked about earlier. Doing so by trying to kill Link, kidnap Zelda for a ritual to revive Demise, being devilishly hammy and overdramatic, and most definitely causing so many young first-time players to have a sexual awakening, myself included. While both he and Demise are obviously defeated by Link in the end, Girahim does ultimately fulfill his purpose in reviving his master, and unleashing the very evil that would later become who we know to be Ganon, thus beginning the seemingly endless cycle of conflict involving these 3 pivotal characters. Now onto that one character from this game. This is where the fun begins, isn't it? This is Fee, arguably one of the most notoriously disliked characters throughout the Zelda series, mainly due to the fact that she dumps a large amount of info on the player, and a lot of it is not very helpful to most people. She's kinda gained the unfortunate reputation of annoying exposition fairy, to the point where the character Toriel from Undertale exists largely as a scathing parody of talkative guide characters like Fee. Here's why I fucking love her. I will admit that her advice does get excessive, but I feel like a lot of the complaints about it are blown way out of proportion. At the absolute worst, even in the Wii version, I thought it was just mildly annoying, not a major detriment to the whole game. To me, she didn't really feel any worse than the other guide characters throughout the Zelda series. Midna and Navi did that a lot too, and they don't get nearly as much heat as Fee does. A few times, I even found her to be pretty helpful, reminding me of my current objective or enemy analysis. As a character, I find her super fascinating. The whole thing of her being this analytical robot fairy is really interesting. Her design is really cool. She has this enchanting demeanor in how she interacts with Link in spite of her inability to convey human emotion, and the girl knows how to dance and sing for sure. But I feel where Fee really shines is in her character arc throughout Skyward Sword. She begins the game with one prime directive and purpose in mind: guide the chosen hero down his destined path. With the possible exception of Girahim, Fi is the character who has the most clarity on what her purpose is and why she was brought into existence. She begins the game only dispassionately existing to be a guide for Link, exclusively giving him an objective and emotionless analysis on everything. But as the game goes on, Fi begins to subtly change in how she communicates to Link. The two forming a friendship, and Fi through their time together coming to understand the beauty of human emotion and existence as a whole. While the other stories are about the characters trying to fulfill their purpose, Fi's story is about her, to the best of her limited abilities, coming to understand what makes existence such a beautiful thing through the process of fulfilling her purpose. It leads to her departure and final moments with Link to express all she now holds dear to be a super impactful moment, and one that actually made me shed a tear the first time I saw it. I feel with all the gameplay related backlash that Fi gets, her actual character doesn't get enough credit for how touching her story really is. A commonality with all the main characters is that their purposes all seem predetermined and part of some divine plan, but there is one character who breaks this mold, and he is an absolute goat. I feel like it says a lot when even people who don't like Skyward Sword can agree that Groose is kinda great. Initially, he starts off as the bully at the academy, picking on everyone and talking shit about Link for being a lazy fuck, showing a lot of envy for his natural intuition and being in great favor with Zelda. Around a third into the game, he ends up following Link into the Faron Woods after wanting to know what he's up to, where he then tries to put on a tough guy facade, but it's obvious to literally anyone that's not actually dead that he's just freaking the fuck out. After Link defeats the Imprisoned for the first time and demonstrates that Groose kinda sucks compared to the chosen hero, he goes through a bit of an existential crisis and a period of feeling worthless and not good at anything. Hitting a bit too close to home for me, game. Over time though, he does begin to discover the talents he does have, and he puts them to use in a helpful, non-selfish manner, even helping out with Link beating the Imprisoned the next few times it emerges. Groose's arc is really endearing, with him developing from a self-absorbed bully to somebody who knows where his strengths lie and where he's needed, ultimately developing a mutual respect for Link's own capabilities, while still retaining a bit of the cartoonishly big ego he has. But it comes off as more charming and funny than punchable. Honestly, I love his story because it diverges from the whole "this is what fate created you for" commonality of the other characters, essentially saying that you can always find a purpose with your own existence, even if some higher being doesn't explicitly give it to you, and I think that's a really nice addition to the game's story. I tend to prefer looking at Zelda stories as their own self-contained, loosely connected anthologies as opposed to a long, continuous narrative, since looking at how each game is connected tends to be way too complicated and confusing for me personally. But given Skyward Sword is at the literal beginning of the timeline, I find it a lot easier to appreciate it for its place in the timeline. It's really neat seeing the origin of several iconic aspects of the elder Zelda games unfold and take form. Along with that is a really damn good villain with Girahim. While he doesn't have as much depth as other Zelda antagonists like Zant or certain variations of Ganondorf, he's just super entertaining. This guy absolutely hams it up whenever he gets screen time, and he easily steals the show with how performative and animated he is. The same can't be said for Demise though. He's pretty weak as a villain and there's not really much of anything to him aside from big scary bad man. He's not fleshed out much, he's not that intimidating, and he kinda just comes and goes. I get that he's more of a prelude to Ganon and Girahim's main objective than anything, but I feel like there was more they could have done with him than basically nothing. He's kinda just a generic brute. It's basically the hijacked by Ganon trope without Ganon actually being there to hijack anything. The storytelling does suffer from a few pacing problems, with way too long periods of little to no plot progression, and the game having a constant cycle of do these 3 things, and then go do these 3 things, and then go do these other 3 things, can get grating and tedious for some. But in spite of this, I still found the story to be super engaging with the themes it puts forward, along with all the bizarre, fantastical charm that always permeates from the Zelda series. I love the protagonists, the antagonist, the people of Skyloft, all the other quirky NPCs you meet throughout your quest. It's all great, and at least to me, it keeps my focus away from any of the weaker aspects of the story. Finally, the more nuanced dialogue options given to Link that would carry over to Breath of the Wild are a really nice touch. They do a great job characterizing him more. So far, aside from Fi, I haven't really addressed all that much that really bears most of the critical blunt this game often gets, but that's about to change. This is where the fun begins, isn't it? On paper, Skyward Sword has just about all the essential things that most people would expect from a 3D Zelda game. If for some reason you don't know how a 3D Zelda typically goes, first of all, I'd recommend climbing out from whatever rock you're under and joining the rest of us mortal losers. And second, I'll give the basic rundown. You start off in your home village, visit several different locations, help the local folk out with whatever bullshit's giving them trouble, conquer a bunch of dungeons and bosses, and obtain new items that'll help you throughout your adventure. Skyward Sword checks all these boxes, but it has its own unique quirks which people tend to be less favorable towards than I imagine Nintendo intended. I should probably get the most obvious one out of the way. Skyward Sword's biggest selling point was its emphasis on motion controls, particularly with the sword combat. It ended up being one of the tiny handful of games where the Wii Motion Plus was required for a number of the more precise movements. This is probably the area that most people are divided on with Skyward Sword, given that there's some people who say the controls aren't good or don't work properly, while others had little to no issues at all. Personally, I never really got what people were talking about when they called the controls unresponsive. Every time I've played this game, they worked perfectly fine for me. I never had any responsiveness issues, the game always detected the correct input. At worst, I had to recenter the sensor a lot, but that takes a split second and it's hardly worth making a fuss over. I don't mean to sound dismissive or anything, but what else am I supposed to say regarding this when I had no issues as long as I wasn't playing like a tweaker? My footage comes from the HD Switch version, so maybe there's been some quality of life tweaks made to the motion controls, but even in the original Wii version, I don't recall running into that many noteworthy issues. There's plenty of people who don't care for motion controls in general, or just how this game does them, and that's totally fine. If it's not your thing, it's not your thing. If you don't like motion controls, you're just not gonna like this game, and that's perfectly fine, but I genuinely never saw what exactly made this game apparently broken and unplayable, since the controls were pretty reliable, and honestly, they feel a lot more intuitive than people give them credit for. I guess bomb throwing and rolling could be a bit finicky, but that was the extent of my issues with the controls, functionality-wise anyways. I'll be brutally honest here, I fucking love the combat in this game. It's a lot more methodical than you'd see in most other Zelda games, requiring you to really stop and think about where you're going to strike most enemies. A lot of them will guard and block one or more sides, making it so you need to bait and trick the enemies into leaving an opening to get some strikes in. The enemy AI is actually pretty competent and tough concerning how the combat works in this game, with enemies frequently blocking, evading, or attacking in a manner that can trip you up easily if you don't play smart. It's relatively simple sword combat, even with the whole motion control aspect, but it's a really fun system to nail down that makes for some of the most satisfying sword combat throughout the entire series if you ask me. The controls in this game just made me enjoy it that much more. The upped frame rate for the Switch version makes it feel smoother as well. Still shouldn't have been $60, but I guess it's at least more than what Twilight Princess HD did. Only downside with not playing the Wii version is that I have no excuse to show off my fabulous pink Wiimote Plus. You know what, fuck it, I'm just gonna do it anyways. Honestly, my biggest criticism with the game's motion controls is how unneeded and gimmicky they can feel. The Loftwing really did not need to be controlled with the pointer, guys. The left thumbstick is free, just use that. That and skydiving feels a bit awkward to get down. Oddly enough, it reminds me of those terrible ball levels from the Mario Galaxy games. It won't appeal to everyone, and if the gamer controls don't click with you, again, that's perfectly fine. But for things like items and, of course, sword combat, yeah, I really like this. It makes for a more unique take on the Zelda formula, and I really appreciate that. The beetle and bow specifically feel super satisfying to use with motion controls. Also, the gust bellows. I like the gust bellows. They blow me away. I'm sorry. A number of the more prominent mechanics in Breath of the Wild actually made their first appearance in Skyward Sword. Stamina, weapon durability, the glider functionality-wise at least, hell, even the motion controls got carried over to an extent. While yes, Breath of the Wild expands on and does more fun, interesting things with most of these mechanics, I'm not gonna harp too hard on Skyward Sword. No pun intended, for comparatively not doing the absolute most with new mechanics that back then had only just been introduced, especially when the additions that Breath of the Wild made just wouldn't fit well into a game like this, and they're still fine additions to the Zelda formula, given that they were clearly just testing the waters with stuff like this. With stamina in particular, it feels like much of the game is deliberately designed around the limited amount you have. Given that it helps you run up slopes, climb, and not sink into the sand, it can make things pretty tense. Seems kinda dark when you pair it next to when he burns his ass on lava. Outside of Skyloft, you'll be visiting 3 main regions, those being Faron Woods, Elden Volcano, and Lanayru Desert, each with their own distinct characteristics. Faron Woods is your mostly calm, serene forest that eases the player into this uncharted territory. Elden Volcano involves a lot of vertical scaling and trying not to burn your ass on hot molten lava, lest you never comfortably sit down or take a shit again. Lanayru Desert has these stones that play around with time and shift certain patches of the land between the barren desert ruins of the present with the lush, technically advanced mining operation of the long-forgotten past. You'll be repeatedly visiting these same few areas throughout the game, but I honestly don't really mind it that much. Each new visit has you doing something different or seeing new unexplored areas on the map. One section I really enjoyed was sailing in the Sand Sea and docking at all the various islands dotted across the area. It gave me a bit of a Wind Waker vibe, and anything that reminds me of Wind Waker is always good. Not sure if this is a hot take or whatever, but I also loved visiting the Silent Realms. They're extra thick in atmosphere, and I'm just a sucker for things like this that have you explore and comb through the area you're in. Though with Elden Volcano, it feels like the development team had trouble coming up with interesting things to do there, given that your second visit is this really long, pointless escort mission that's, in my opinion, the worst part of the game. And your third visit is a stealth section, which I would ordinarily hate, but I actually found it pretty fun here. I don't know, I just enjoyed being methodical and working with each individual item as I got them back. My favorite region is easily Lanayru Desert because of the aforementioned time stones. They not only make for some striking visual contrast, but the way they're used mechanically throughout the whole setting is really clever. That, and it adds quite a bit in terms of the world building. Despite Skyward Sword being the first game chronologically, there's still years upon years of history prior to its events. It kind of unintentionally makes the other two regions seem worse than they actually are. A common complaint towards Skyward Sword is how linear it is compared to other games in the franchise, and while yes, that is true, I don't think that's a problem here personally. Honestly, I like the more linear take on a Zelda adventure. It has a bit of a Metroidvania feel to it, with the way items allow you to access new areas, shortcuts to give you a quicker path between different spots, and of course the backtracking and revisiting areas. There's still plenty to find and explore too. Heart pieces, all the goddess cubes to unlock chests in the sky, the various side quests and minigames throughout the game. If you want a Nintendo published game where linearity actually ruined the whole thing, Other M came out a year before this. I don't think Skyward Sword's linearity is anywhere near that egregious. Mario Galaxy 1 and 2 are fucking masterpieces, and nobody complains about them being linear compared to 64 and Sunshine. During this era, linearity was kinda just how Nintendo did things with their IPs. Kinda like how their trend nowadays is more open-ended stuff like Breath of the Wild and Mario Odyssey. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it failed, and sometimes it added another thing for the human race to argue for the rest of our feeble existence. This next thing is entirely personal bias, but honestly, given how many open-world sandbox games we get every year, it feels refreshing to play something that feels less bloated and more contained. There are problems for sure. They could have actually tried to connect the three regions together, so you don't have to go into the sky and then fly over to another beam of light to visit a different region. And they could have also put in a method of fast travel that's not locked behind a $25 amiibo, on top of the $60 you already had to pay for an HD port of a near-decade-old Wii game. But I think overall it makes for an interesting take on the usual Zelda structure. God, I haven't even gotten to the dungeons yet. The lineup here is super strong and among the best in the series, easily. With how motion control centric Skyward Sword is, the dungeons make the absolute most use out of this, and that mainly comes down to how much the items you get take advantage of it. On paper, they're not anything too out of the ordinary for Zelda items, but the nature of how Skyward Sword plays gives a new feeling to even the most typical Zelda items, and it's a good feeling. I don't care what 2-hour video essays try to convince me otherwise. All the dungeons in general just feel so much more grand and huge than they've ever been in any previous Zelda game. All the outdoor space and large expansive rooms give the dungeons a much larger overall feeling of scale as a result. If I hadn't played this game and you told me that the Skyview Temple was the first dungeon in the game, I would not believe you. This place is massive for a first dungeon especially. Special mention to the Ancient Cistern for being a genuinely well-designed water dungeon with some incredible Buddhist-like imagery, and a really clever parallel to a short story called The Spider's Thread, as well as both the Lanayru mining facility and sandship for further making clever use of the time stones. The latter especially is pretty unique for a Zelda dungeon and easily my favorite in the series, though the game is pretty inconsistent about how much use each dungeon item gets outside of the dungeon. The beetle is used pretty damn often, which is understandable, it's pretty cool, and even the gust bellows get some pretty decent mileage, but the whip outside of the Ancient Cistern doesn't really get much use. I think I can count on one hand the number of times the game actually has you use this thing outside the dungeon you get it in. Shame too, because it's a really unique item. There is one dungeon I'm pretty iffy on, and unfortunately, it happens to be the final dungeon. It takes bits and pieces from all 6 prior dungeons, which is fine. Ocarina of Time's finale did that too, but for some reason there's this really annoying and confusing puzzle that makes this entire dungeon take an eternity to finish. Trying to figure out how to get each Triforce piece, getting stuck, accidentally walking out of the dungeon and having to start the whole thing all over again, this part fucking sucks. As for the bosses, the selection is admittedly a mixed bag. Galactos, for example, makes great use of the whip, and picking up one of those giant swords to slice into ribbons is ultra satisfying. Tantalus, despite having a hilariously dumb design after so much buildup, was a fun sea monster encounter. The final Girahim battle is a great test of your skills with sword combat, and even the final boss was a really good spectacle to end the game off on. For the most part, the other bosses are fine and par for the course for Zelda, but believe me, there are some major duds here. The boss of the 3rd dungeon, Moldarak, is really pathetic. It's functional, but not really fun or interesting at all. Just hit the claws and the eye in the center while waiting for his really slow telegraphed attacks that are easier to dodge than taxes are for rich people to dodge. If this was a mini-boss or even just the first boss of the game, he'd be fine. But he's the 3rd main boss of the game, and given what other Zelda games had to offer for desert-themed bosses, he's just really boring concept-wise. Giant scorpion, whoop-de motherfucking goddamn do. Also, you randomly fight him again later on for some reason. But that's far from the most infamous example of a boss you have to fight multiple times in this game. Well, I had to get to this at some point too. To be fair, I don't think the Imprisoned is quite as bad as most people make it out to be. It doesn't take that long to defeat, and it at least does enough new in each rematch that in a better fight would make the repeat encounters not quite as grating. The problem is that this boss just isn't good. At all. It's so tedious to get any hits on these sack toe things, because they're always moving away from you, and eventually his stomping causes these shockwaves that you can only keep your distance from due to the lack of a dedicated jump button. And the other method of attacking him while you have the high ground, while faster, isn't entirely perfect. Skyward Sword, like Zelda games before, has you automatically jump after walking off the edge of a platform. Since you have no control of Link in mid-air and the Imprisoned is always on the move, it's kind of a crapshoot whether you'll even land on his head, not helping that the collision detection on him feels pretty janky all things considered. I will happily defend many things about this game. The Imprisoned is not one of those things. You know, I got a bit more critical toward this game than I was honestly expecting to. Even as someone who really does genuinely love this game, it's definitely not perfect. A number of things in this game aren't exactly executed to their fullest potential, some parts I will never defend, and there is certainly a bit of jank to be found, especially when playing with the Pro Controller. Analog stick sword combat? No thanks. That shit blew total ass in Metal Gear Solid 2, I'd rather not put up with it in a 30-hour adventure game. This game, for better and worse, was made for Wii motion controls and nothing else. But at least in my very subjective and stupid opinion, the things this game gets right, it really gets right. I'm just too busy getting immersed into fun and satisfying sword combat, exploring mysterious unknown lands, and flying in the sky as if this suddenly became a How to Train Your Dragon movie, to be all that put off by the same types of issues I think every game in the series has to some extent. I got pretty much all my issues with this game out of the way, so now I can go over how goddamn beautiful this game is in terms of graphics and music. I've always loved how each 3D Zelda game has their own unique art styles. The simple but iconic low-poly look of Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask, Wind Waker's cartoony cell shading, Breath of the Wild's slightly more realistic take on cell shading, the atmospheric dark fantasy aesthetic from Twilight Princess, and most relevantly, the painterly look of Skyward Sword that's most reminiscent of paintings from the Impressionist era. The game has somewhat of a splotchy look to it, with all the environments looking as if they're textured with brushstrokes. It's an art style I haven't seen done that often, if at all, in a game, and I love how it looks here. It does a wonderful job allowing each environment to really nail the vibe they're aiming for. Elden Volcano in particular feels exactly what I imagine it'd be like to be in an active volcanic region. Even just based on how the game looks, you can tell that enclosed areas like the first 2 fire dungeons and the volcanic interior are basically giant 1000-degree ovens that'd bake you alive. That and the present version of Lanayru Desert looks absolutely dirty and bone dry. At the same time, when the game wants to look lush and alive like with Skyloft, Faron Woods, and Lanayru in the past, it nails that too. In particular, the shifting between past and present Lanayru is super striking. I'm a bit of a sucker for seeing dead landscapes come back to life, so I approve of this fully. Traversing across Lanayru Sea is a personal highlight for me, just watching the desert sand shift into seawater. I love it, this absolutely fucks. A few of the character models probably could have been tweaked a bit. King Gabora looks stoned off his ass with them big old eyes, but I'd say overall they look pretty solid. Link's design here is straight up one of, if not his absolute best design across the entire series. He has a really wide range of expressions which add a bit more character to this dork, and they can be absolutely hysterical to see on screen. The looks of fear on his face when he's about to be pushed by Zelda or plunged to the earth below by Groose are just pure gold. This is the face of a man whose life is flashing before his eyes. Or here, look how happy he is. I want to give this pure boy a head pat. The villains are also really memorable in terms of design, and they can look pretty scary when the game wants them to be. Demise might be pretty underwhelming as an actual villain, but the dude absolutely commands a strong presence based on his design alone. Even the scenery chewing Girahim can be quite intimidating. Personally though, my favorite character, design-wise, is Zelda. With this being a more youthful and innocent version of the character, Skyward Sword Zelda looks absolutely adorable. It doesn't feel like they sacrificed anything about her or tried to go too far with cutesying her up or anything. She still looks and feels like how this character should be, just more carefree because she's younger. For a Wii game from about a decade ago, Skyward Sword still holds up phenomenally on the visual end, even compared to a lot of games on more powerful hardware at the time. It's one of the best looking Wii games, and yeah, it was a nice bonus getting to play this game again in HD at 60 frames per second, despite those big pesky mushrooms not abiding by the upped frame rate. Delinquent little shits. And finally, the music. I adore the soundtrack in this game, it's without a doubt my favorite across the entire series. There's so much variety here in terms of mood, scale, and instrumentation. Ranging from the grand orchestra for when you're soaring through the skies or fighting a boss, some of the more relaxing tunes for when you're peacefully strolling through the world, along with plenty of tracks that convey a desired emotion or convey a specific type of atmosphere. Admittedly, while yes, a good majority of the music is more focused on building atmosphere over providing catchy melodies, it builds some damn thick atmosphere. The composers brought their A game for Skyward Sword. The Sealed Temple, Isle of Songs, and Temple Spring, while by no means bombastic, are just so nice and soothing to listen to. There's some pretty clever dynamic music as well, specifically in Lanayru. When stepping in or out of an area affected by a time stone, the current music dynamically shifts from this melancholy tune that sounds almost mournful of this long-deceased civilization, to a much more lively, mechanical-sounding track that kinda sounds like machinery at work. I also love how there's several variations of Fi's theme, for her mysterious first appearance, her proper introduction, her emotional goodbye scene, and her final moments of expressing gratitude for all she's gotten to experience before departing. It almost feels like the music is guiding Link on his quest alongside Fi herself. It's also really clever how the game's main theme, Ballad of the Goddess, is a reversed version of Zelda's lullaby. Given that the former's main purpose is to awaken Zelda from her slumber, while the latter is, well, a lullaby. I could go on further, but I think this video is long enough already, so I'm gonna wrap it up here. Skyward Sword is the black sheep of the Zelda series, at least when talking about the 3D games, and don't get me wrong, I do understand why. It does a lot of things that simply just didn't sit right with everyone, even without the motion controls. There's a notable amount of design choices that honestly would have made for a better game had they been done differently, or just excluded from the final game. Some I didn't even feel like bringing up because I want to enjoy making videos. It's not a perfect game, and it's pretty hard to deny that. Nowadays I prefer other Zelda games like Wind Waker, Breath of the Wild, and maybe Twilight Princess depending on the day. I don't really know for sure, I need to play all these games again at some point. But that all said, I still love Skyward Sword. Through all of the awkward pacing and odd filler and design choices, I still find a wonderful game with stunning presentation, fun combat and mechanics that are enhanced rather than hindered by motion controls, and a beautiful story about lost and distraught characters finding their purpose and unlocking their full potential. I'm not expecting to actually change anyone's mind here. I'm one person in an endless sea of internet content. If I did, that's cool and all, but I'm just putting out my honest thoughts on a game that's over the years had a huge personal impact on me, in spite of how divisive it is from basically everybody. At the time I played it, it showed me firsthand just how powerful a medium gaming can be. It doesn't have to be just a fun time killer, or a product for analyzing in the most bland, calculated, soulless way imaginable, but a beautiful medium that has the capability of being as impactful and emotionally moving as film or literature. On top of that, it led to me playing through what would become one of my favorite game series. I still love this game and I always will, but even if I didn't, I'd still be grateful for having played it, given how it impacted the way I viewed the medium as a whole. Whether you agree or disagree, I hope you all enjoyed the video. If you did, consider leaving a like, sharing, and subscribing. Next video is gonna be on a little-known Metroidvania title. It's not the one that recently came out, but I can assure you it's pretty close in quality. Look forward to that. Take care and thanks for watching, I'm out.